thanks so much, and welcome to our session on advancing library publishing infrastructure, an update on the Next Gen Library Publishing Project. I'm Katherine Mitchell, Director of Publishing Archives and Digitization at the California Digital Library, one of the co-PIs on this project and your moderator for this session, which will include project updates from Paul Walk, Katherine Skinner, Zach Davis, and Kristen Ratan. I will introduce each of these speakers as we transition to their section of the presentation. I can say now, however, that we are all delighted to be back at the Library Publishing Forum, following our community requirements gathering workshop at last year's forum, to report on the substantial progress we have made on NGLP this year across multiple areas of focus. We're also delighted to see so many of you here and hope you will, if you feel so inspired, by the end of the presentation, share your contact information to engage with us as we dig into some important work in the coming months. For those of you who might be unfamiliar with this project, NGLP responds directly to the ongoing conversation across the library publishing community about the need for more robust open source publishing tools and a broader set of hosted publishing services. This topic has been a point of focus at the Library Publishing Forum for the past several years and animates a great many informal conversations among library publishers as we consider our increasingly substantial roles and opportunities within the scholarly communication landscape. NGLP's goal is to address this specific need within the community, and in so doing, to expand the range of publishing pathways for authors, editors, and readers who seek to distribute and access knowledge in ways that are values aligned with the academic enterprise. We recognize that we are not alone in this endeavor and appreciate in particular the remarkable spate of platform innovation in this space in the past few years. We also appreciate and build upon the substantial work and findings of the IMLS-funded Library Publishing Workflows Project and other projects that will be called out more specifically in this presentation. When we were here at the 2020 Library Publishing Forum, we were on a fact-finding mission to understand how library publishers work and how their current publishing tools and platforms might serve them better. That workshop was one among many efforts led by Kristen Ratan to engage the community in requirements gathering exercises, resulting in consultations with nearly 300 of you in some form or another. What we learned is that this community needs turnkey hosted journal plus IR solutions as an alternative to bepress. Among the explicit wants animating this need were requests for an open source solution that is community owned and governed, a modular architecture that integrates existing open source platforms rather than creating brand new ones, mission-aligned service providers who were both affordable and reliable, robust reporting tools, metadata support, and because none of this matters unless it's easy to transport data, migration support into any new kind of solution. Based on these findings, we identified 4 central areas of activity that we believe are fundamental to the success of this project. Understanding the range of technical tools and services within the open source scholarly communication space, creating mechanisms to help technology and service providers affirm the values and principles that guide their work, building infrastructure to support modular publishing and repository solutions, and establishing a healthy ecosystem of community-led, values-aligned service providers for the library publishing community. We also defined a set of deliverables that corresponds to these areas of focus. You can access these documents and the community research findings that inform this work at the URL at the bottom of this slide. As you can see from the list, the groundwork is laid, and now it's time to start building connections and solutions. We'll dig into much of this work in today's presentation. So we begin with a discussion of the development of the Scholarly Communication Technology Catalog, or as we affectionately refer to it, SComCat, led by Paul Walk, representing the Confederation of Open Access Repositories, one of the partners in the NGLP project. Paul is a technical consultant with 30 years experience working with information systems and web services primarily in the higher education and cultural heritage sectors. Between 2006 and 2013, Paul was deputy director at UCaln, I apologize if that's pronounced differently, University of Bath, leaving to join Edina, University of Edinburgh, as head of technology strategy and planning until 2017. More recently, Paul started a consultancy business, AntLeaf, specializing in the development of and support for metadata standards, repository systems, and their integration with networked services, and R&D into distributed scholarly communications. Go ahead, Paul.
Well, thank you, Katherine. And yes, UConn that's how you pronounce it. Yeah. So I'm going to give a very quick overview of SComCat, and I'm going to cover just very quickly the purpose, design, features, and a little note about the sustainability for this. The URL for the application is there, www.scomcat.net, so you can please do go and have a look for yourselves. So next slide, please. So the purpose of SComCat, initially we realized that we needed to really do a fairly deep scan of the available technologies which are pertinent to next generation publishing. And there were other sources available where people had done some kind of desktop research. The most impressive of these was the that we found anyway was the Mind the Gap reports from John Maxwell and his team. And so we were able to use they were very kind and shared their data with us initially. And then from that, it became apparent that there was an opportunity to build something a little more interactive, some kind of a tool, in fact, to allow people to explore this space. And so we used the data from the Mind the Gap report to seed that, and then added to it over the course of the last year. So this has evolved into a sustainable and dynamic online database, which, as Katherine says, we have given the clunky name SComCat. That's my fault, so I make no apology for it, though. Next slide, please, Katherine. So a quick word about the design. So this is actually a relatively simple relational database web application. It's built in Ruby on Rails, if you care about that kind of thing. And essentially, it's conceived as a catalog. So there are records for each of the technologies. We use the term technologies to cover, it's a deliberately generic word used to sort of cover software, standards, services, anything like that, which is relevant to the space we're working in. And so for each technology, there is a record in this catalog. And then the records themselves have a fairly substantial amount of metadata, which you can see an example of one on that on the slide there. Some of this metadata is just simple metadata, such as a link to the declared license for an open source system, or URLs for the domain web pages for those things. And some of the metadata is a little more complex. We've developed a whole set of classifications for these technologies, which I'll talk a little about in a second, with the idea of building a, this is where it becomes able to function as a tool. It allows people to do a certain amount of faceted searching and browsing so that they can begin to find technologies which satisfy their various criteria. Built into it is also some fairly simple, but I hope potentially useful dependency mapping. So where a particular technology depends on some other technology which is in the catalog, then these are linked in this way so that you can begin to get a sense of the dependencies for the thing that you're looking at. Next slide, please. So I alluded to the faceted search. Because this is really conceived as a tool, the faceted search is actually the homepage of the application. There's no messing around here. You just go straight to this screen, and this is where all the action is. And the facets which we've introduced, I'll just very quickly enumerate these, but we've got function, category, and so on. So function is, I hope, fairly self-explanatory. It's a set of functions that effectively a little vocabulary of functions which are relevant to publishing. And so each technology is associated with 0 or more of those functions, well, typically 1 or more of those functions. Category is where we declare what sort of technology it is, so whether it's a standard or a piece of software, open source software, or a running service or something like this. Business form is an attempt to create a control vocabulary which describes the way in which the service or the software is owned, in a sense. It's the ownership for that. So we might have proprietary software that's quite rare in this catalog, or we might have, for example, software which is maintained by some community, or we might have software which is maintained by a recognized organization. And there are various types of these. This is very similar to governance, but we separated these two because we wanted to really drill down into the types of governance which are applied to these things, which range from no governance at all through to very formal governance arrangements. Status is fairly self-explanatory. It's a very quick vocabulary indicating the status of the technology. Adoption level is an attempt to just indicate whether the technology is widely used, or perhaps just a unique instance that's running in one place, or in a few cases it's completely ubiquitous, it's used by everybody. And finally, technology readiness level, which is a scheme which was developed by NASA, in fact, in the 70s, but is used quite heavily by the European Union in its funding. So we just adopted that standard for describing whether the technology is essentially its level of maturity, whether it's sort of at a prototype level, or it's something which has been deployed in production, or various degrees in between those. Next slide, please. One small detail, but it's an important detail, is that all of the data in here is available not only as a human readable HTML view, but also in machine readable format. So you can download the entire catalog as CSV, so which would be suitable for loading into Microsoft Excel or something like that, or as JSON if you are more inclined to try to do something programmatically with the data. And I will be introducing those machine readable downloads into a few of the other screens so that it becomes a more useful tool. Next slide, please. So finally, a little note about sustainability. So the data, sorry, that's my alarm. The data is licensed as Creative Commons, and the software is licensed with the MIT license, which is really one of the most permissive licenses. All of the source code is on GitHub. The system itself is designed to be deployed in a standard Docker container, and it's actually currently deployed in a Kubernetes environment. So all of that is available in the GitHub repository. And it's currently being maintained by Core, by me, effectively, for the project until the end of the NGLP project. That's the arrangement. So we are actively seeking a new home for, or some organization perhaps, to take ownership of this if the community is interested in seeing this continue and thrive into the future. And I think that was my last slide, so thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, we're now going to transition to a discussion of the substantial work we've done around values and principles led by Dr. Katherine Skinner, a co-PI on this project. Katherine is the executive director of the Educopia Institute, a not-for-profit educational organization that empowers collaborative communities to create, share, and preserve knowledge. In this role, she has helped to found a range of thriving community-led networks, including the Meta Archive Cooperative, the Library Publishing Coalition, you might have heard of it, the Bit Curator Consortium, and the Software Preservation Network. She has also provided training, facilitation, and consulting to nurture and strengthen more than 36 communities and organizations, from C4DISC to CRL, and from community webs to IOI. Take it away, Katherine.
Thanks, Katherine. All right, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So one of the most important parts of this project, and one of the guiding pieces of this project, has been the PIs and project teams' insistence, I would say, not just belief, but true insistence that values and principles matter in scholarly publishing, and that right now the principles and values that we associate with scholarly publishing and with the academic mission are very unevenly aspired to and accomplished by the publishers and tool providers and other service providers who are acting in our sector today. Go ahead to the next slide, Katherine. And I'll admit, I mean, these are not charitable, or at least the first one's not, maybe the second one is too much so, but I do make a distinction, and I make a careful distinction between profit-driven and mission-driven publishers. What I do not mean by profit-driven and mission-driven, nor does the team, is that for-profits are by nature bad and not-for-profits are by nature good. Neither of those things are true. We can find lots of exceptions to both of those rules. But a profit-driven publisher is looking to maximize profit over time. That's what success is measured by primarily. Whereas a mission-driven publisher is really looking in our minds towards open access to information, spreading knowledge, making sure that the things that we learn in our cultures and societies are truly spread as far as they can be and as equitably as they can be. Those are the things that we want mission-driven publishers to aspire to, and hopefully they do, and that's where their success metric is. Katherine? One of the problems, of course, is that defining that in measurable ways is really, really complicated. So at the beginning of this project, we set out to do a couple of different things, specifically around values and principles that undergirds and goes along with all of the other, development work and other components of this project. So on the values and principles side, we started with a research project that Sarah Wipperman and I took on, Sarah Wipperman at Villanova. And what we were looking at was the many, many values and principles documents that have been created over the years, all the manifestos and letters and all of the different pieces that have been produced since roughly the late 90s until now, to assess what else there, what's in common. Do they have a piece that is kind of core to them that we can identify? Then we moved forward, and Sarah Lippincott and I worked together on values and principles framework based on the findings that Sarah Wipperman and I had discussed in the first report here, Living Our Values. And we put forward a framework and checklist to first define what are some of the values and principles that are recognized and regularly referred to within our sector. And then how do you measure adherence to those? What are some genuinely measurable ways, numerical maybe, or what kinds of documentation should you have? What kind of processes should you have if you really are adhering to transparency? These kinds of things. And so we released beta frameworks for both of those in 2020. And by the end of the project, we will be releasing new versions of those. And then we have worked with our own tools and infrastructures to make sure that those groups that the NGLP project is working with are actually adhering to values and principles that we believe are important and that we've seen enumerated within the field. And then finally, number 5 on here is the piece that we'll be putting forward soon, which is going to be the framework and toolkit revised and hopefully operational in ways that other groups can use. And we're aiming to do that by the end of 2021, but I'm being generous for us and saying 2022 here. Last slide. So some of the findings. One is that there are well over 200 values and principles documents floating around out there. And many, many thanks to Force 11 and other groups that have done some of the work of collating these already. But we took a look at as many of them as we could, the letters, declarations, policies, all of those pieces. And what we found is that most of them are opt-in statements. They rely on loose and coded terminology that you kind of have to be in group to understand, and that really definitions of, even things like community-led, as Katherine Mitchell and Melanie Schlosser wrote a paper on last year, or a piece on last year. It's hard to know, what does that really mean? Community governed? There are lots of different ways you could define that. So there's this kind of loose terminology at the base of many of these values and principles documents. Most of them are not issued by standards making bodies. So they instead are very informal documents, and compliance is really voluntary and unregulated. So part of what we're studying now is, how do we move not all the way to something that is overbearingly assessment and audit oriented, but to something that really lets us say, what are the principles we care about? What is it that we want to mark as a field, as library publishers? What is it that we want to mark that we think matters? And then how do we make sure that those that we purchase from, that we work with, that we build relationships with, are actually adhering to those things? So with that said, I will go ahead and let this move to the next piece of the presentation.
Thank you, Katherine.
Yep.
Okay, now on to the details of 2 substantial technology development projects currently underway for NGLP to help us realize our vision of a modular, interoperable journal publishing and IR solution, led in part by Zach Davis. Zach is the president of Cast Iron Coding, a web development studio in Portland, Oregon. He received his PhD in English from CUNY Graduate Center and graduated in the CUNY system for many years, and taught, in the CUNY system for many years before founding Cast Iron. He is the technical lead on Manifold Scholarship and is currently leading Cast Iron's design and development of the NGLP web delivery platform. Go ahead, Zach.
Thanks, Katherine. So I'm going to try to give a high-level overview of the 2 products that we're building for this project. But before I do that, I just want to take a second to review some of our guiding principles around development, which were generated by these conversations that we had with the library publishing community. So first, we see what we're building as a piece in a larger puzzle. We don't think it serves the community to build a monolith that tries to solve all library publishing problems. Instead, we're trying to create products that solve a couple specific problems that the community flagged as important. Second, we want to make sure that what we build is truly and forever open source. So sticking with open source has ramifications in terms of what underlying technologies we use, and we're trying to be really thoughtful and careful in our choices here. Third, we're trying to be intentional around ensuring that we're building sustainable products. We've all seen software come and go because it lacked a sustainable business model. This last year or 2, I've been grappling with this firsthand in my work on Manifold with CUNY and the University of Minnesota Press. Finding a sustainable path for these open source tools is really challenging. Kristen will speak about this more, but one thing that I think is really smart about this project is the deliberate early engagement with potential service providers in an effort to seed these sustainable business models. Next slide, please, Katherine. Okay, so what are we actually building here? Well, we're building 2 distinct pieces of software. The 3 color blocks in this diagram illustrate what we're trying to achieve. In gray, we have the content platform, so Janeway, OJS, and DSpace initially. The assumption is that most, but not necessarily all, of our users will have content in one of these 3 systems. The gray box also lists the things we're not trying to solve. So we're not trying to solve submission, review, and curation. Our expectation is that these workflow problems will be addressed before the content comes into the web delivery platform. The blue blocks show the two new products that we're creating. My team, Cast Iron Coding, is responsible for building the web delivery platform. Another team, Cottage Labs, is developing the analytics platform. The web delivery platform, or I'll just call it the WDP, is responsible for displaying, discovering, and disseminating content. The analytics platform collects data about how content is produced in the content platforms, as well as how content is consumed in the delivery platform, and provides reporting on that data. So I'll go into a little more detail on each platform. Next slide, please. The WDP is essentially a schema-driven repository of content generated in the upstream tools, again, OJS, Janeway, or DSpace. It will ingest content from these systems, normalize that content into a consistent structure, store it, and then present it on the web. The kinds of content that can be stored in the WDP will be determined by schemas that can be loaded into the application. Initially, we'll create these schemas and we'll focus on schemas that support traditional journal content. In future iterations, we expect to allow administrators to define their own schemas, which would allow the WDP to store and present different kinds of content, such as dissertations, department content, etc. Next slide, please. One big goal of the WDP is to create a central presentation and discovery layer for journal and potentially IR content that's coming from different sources. That said, the WDP will also allow direct entry of content through backend interfaces, making it useful for groups who aren't using the 3 content platforms. The central presentation will also make it possible to consolidate reporting on how readers are interacting with that content. Next slide, please. And that brings us to the platform, the other tool that we're building in this project. So where the WDP attempts to consolidate content delivery, the analytics platform consolidates the collection and the reporting of usage data. The WDP, the presentation layer, will report events, reading, searching, etc., to the analytics platform. Similarly, we hope to produce plugins for the content platforms that make it possible to record events around how journal content is produced and to store those events in this analytics database. Library users will be able to log in to the analytics platform using the same credentials they use for the WDP and see reporting for the full life cycle, production and consumption of journal content. Next slide. I'll talk quickly about how we're approaching development. So first, in keeping with the broader vision of small, cooperating, complementary products, we're building the WDP itself in a modular way. All the content stored in the WDP will be available over a GraphQL API, and we'll build separate applications for the front end and back end user interfaces that are first-class consumers of that API. During development, we're focusing, as always, on user experience. So the design and development team here is the same group who built Manifold, and we really want to elevate the user experience, both for content producers and consumers. Academic software doesn't have to be terrible, and institutional repositories don't have to be user experience wastelands. We want to build a platform that's a joy to use, that's easy to install, manage, and maintain. And we want to build this on modern technologies using current best practices. Next slide, please. So I'll just kind of be brief on this last slide and try to summarize where we're at right now. We're on a pretty tight timeline with this project. So there's a number of development and design tracks unfolding kind of simultaneously. Cast Iron is currently wrapping up UX design on the back end, and we're starting in on visual design and getting into branding a little bit. We've settled on architecture and essentially on our tech stack, which is looking like it's going to be, at least on the WDP side, primarily Ruby and JavaScript. And we're starting to write code and focusing right now on authentication and authorization. One technical decision we've made is to leverage an existing tool called Keycloak as an identity provider. This will simplify a lot of what can be really thorny issues around integrating authorization authentication with existing identity providers at institutions. Cottage Labs is currently developing the analytics platform, and they're defining and documenting the various events that it will track. And my team and Cottage Labs are in close and constant communication and are cooperating on these two projects. So we're making strong progress. And I think I can speak for everyone and say we're really excited to keep sharing our progress with the community in the coming year. Thanks, Katherine.
Thanks, Zach. Okay, and finally, let's move to to an articulation of the kind of service provider ecosystem that we're working toward in this project to support the library publishing community, as described by Kristen Ratan, the third co-PI on this project. Kristen is the principal of Strategies for Open Science, also known as Stratos, working with open science funders, advocates, and infrastructure providers to produce tangible results towards open scholarship. Kristen has a 20-year history working to accelerate advances in science and research communication through work at COCO, PLOS, Highwire, Adapon, and Biosys. Kristen is on the boards of the American Institute of Physics Publishing, Rapid Science, and the ASAP Bio and advisory boards of Invest in Open Infrastructure, IOI, MIT Press, Stencilla, DataSeer, and Pre-Review. Take it away, Kristen.
Thanks, Katherine. Before we jump into the service layer, which is super interesting, I want to make a couple quick comments on what Zach was talking about. We were very intentional about leveraging existing platforms where we could. There are amazing open source tools out there like OJS and Janeway, DSpace, Islandora, and our community, the library publishing community was very clear. Use things that already work when you can, and only build for where we don't have a current solution available. Everything in the whole ecosystem that we are endorsing or building has to be fully open source and reusable. And so we had to pick carefully what would be involved in including everything in the stack that's Cast Iron Coding and Cottage Labs are building. So everything all the way down to the bottom layer of infrastructure is open source in permissible license. So there was a question in the chat, web delivery platform only references to journals. Our initial approach, and this is again what we heard from the community, is to focus on journals and IR. It was that combination, the combination, for example, that Digital Commons has, that people really wanted to see a fully open source solution for. So our focus initially is journals and institutional repository content flowing through DSpace and these two journal platforms, although we're happy to be able to swap in others, and having a unified web delivery layer and unified analytics. And that really came through in the responses that a lot of you and others in the community gave us. So that's our approach. It's a very modular approach, and I'll talk a little bit about why that's important. It's everything that we're building, including the work that Cast Iron Coding is doing. As we know, they have a lot of book experience, is extensible. So we should be able to layer books in. The web delivery platform is fairly content agnostic, which is very exciting, having come from journal publishing platforms where we kind of focused very heavily on one form of content and then had difficulty bringing in other forms. This platform is truly content agnostic. So let's talk about the service layer. One thing that came clear in all of the discussions was that many libraries don't want to have to host their own open source tools and link them together and make them all work. And even if they are doing it, they're interested in getting away from having to do it. And if they're not doing it because they're currently using hosted solutions like Digital Commons, they would like that to be their new solution. So they want that hosted solution, and they care deeply about who is the hosted partner. There's a lot of interest in having community-led, trusted partners who are in fact aligned with the values and principles that Katherine mentioned. And that's a very, very strong interest from the community. So what we're doing is we're endorsing and integrating solutions that we are already out there that are mission aligned and open source with these new technologies that fill gaps and then hopefully tie things together. And what we're doing is creating essentially a toolkit for any service provider to come along and assemble a solution. So we have several service providers we're already working with from the beginning, and those include California Digital Library, which is of course a service provider for the UC system. Lyrasis, which has hosted other open source platforms very successfully, and Longleaf Services, which currently does book production work and is a part of the University of North Carolina Press and is interested in expanding their services into new areas. So watch that space. There'll be some interesting announcements that they'll be making as well. So those were the three that started, but we have attracted other service providers who are interested in being in this mix. And the whole idea is to have a whole rich, healthy ecosystem of different service providers. There are a lot of library publishing activities happening around the globe. And we would like to be able to have common toolkit that would serve the needs of many, many, and allow people to contribute back to that toolkit and make it work for them and their use case. And so that layer of service providers is essential to make that happen. Next slide, please. So the modularity in the technology that we described actually really serves the need of that healthy ecosystem of service providers. What you want is for a hosted service to come along, one of the partners I mentioned or a new one, and say the market I really want to serve, for example, includes these different kinds of publishing activities. I want to serve journals and IR. I'd like to do journals and books. I'd like to do IR and books. It could be any combination. And so over time, as our technology ecosystem grows, more hosted services can provide a more rich and diverse set of solutions. And so this means there's a lot of choice. It means that hopefully there is choice at the level of a service provider deciding what components they want to pull together for their solution, and choice for the library publishing community in terms of which of those service provider solutions best meets your needs. And this is the beginning of that modular ecosystem. Next slide. Which brings the question of NGLP. I've had a lot of people ask, well, what is the role of NGLP? Will you be a hosted service? Are you going to be doing this work? And that is not the role of NGLP. We came into this to be able to bring investment and bring development resources to bear to improve the state of this space, of the infrastructure that is needed for library publishing activities. So we got a generous grant from the Arcadia Fund, and then we did this work to listen to the library publishing community through a whole number of different outreach activities. And now we're assembling and building new technologies and assembling existing ones in order for service providers to take on. So the next step is to help those service providers set up pilots, which will be coming later this year and into early 2020. And there will be a number of pilot activities to get involved with should you wish to participate. We'll be asking for you to sign something. If you're interested in signing up just to learn more, sign up for our newsletter kind of communication thing at the end of this presentation. And so as we move through development and into the point where these things are ready to be served up to the library publishing community, our service providers will be able to announce these pilots. And we'll learn from the pilots. We'll learn what else we need to provide. What are people eager for? What are the next steps? We'll be building minimum viable products for these components. And we want to know what the community really wants us to do on top of that. So in terms of selecting service providers and vetting service providers to participate in this process, the key is that our values and principles are truly guiding that process. And we're lucky in this space to have a lot of existing service providers or technology providers that are committed to open source, committed to community-led and community-governed infrastructures. And then over time, we hope to continue to do this work until this ecosystem is ready to kind of take off and fly on its own. And then at that point, NGLP can really step back as a project and let this ecosystem thrive. I think that's me.
Thanks, Kristen. So we just want to end by acknowledging all the folks who've contributed so substantially to this complex project so far and who continue to work so hard to wrangle its complexities into submission. We are also immensely grateful to our advisory board members who inspire us with their wisdom and ambitions for this space. And as Kristen mentioned, None of this work could have been done without the generous support of the Arcadia Fund. So we're going to move to questions at this point, but I would love if someone could just, as someone, maybe Kristen or Katherine, grab this URL and put it in the chat. This is a place where we would encourage you to sign up to engage with us as we move forward. We have lots of work ahead and are eager to engage with the community throughout the process for anything from requirements refinement to user testing to reality checks, and to keep you up to date on what we're doing. We promise not to talk to you too often, but we'd love to talk to you a little. So please do sign up. Okay, I'm going to stop screen share now and let's move to the Q&A.